Hello. My name's Dehydrated Water. Hello. What? My name's Dehydrated Water. Well, hang on a minute. What are you doing here? This is my channel. This is an SCP Secret Laboratory video. The SCP Secret Laboratory Facility Guard, TM, me, will present it. But, go on. Shoot. Fine. As you wish. Fine.
That's better. Hello, my name's Dehydrated Water. You may remember me from that one facility guard guide that's now horrifically outdated. Regardless, today I'm here to talk about player agency. I consider it to be the single most direct and important influence on player enjoyment in SCP Secret Laboratory. As in, the level of impact someone has on a round directly determines how much they enjoy playing it. This is not something I can definitively prove in any sense, as there may be those whose end subjective experience differs from my own, but if you are unconvinced, I pose to you this: why play the game if you can't influence it? Indeed, are you playing a game at all if you have no influence? If you are simply rolling dice, the only influence you can have over their numbers is whether or not they are rolled at all. For comparison, if you went to play a game like this, your only impactful decision would be whether or not to click launch. Everything occurring thenceforth a result only of luck. If the events in the game occur only due to luck, then you can hardly claim any accomplishment or achievement when you win. Indeed, you didn't really win at all, as you had no influence over the outcome. Regardless, SCP-SL is not that bad, not by a long shot. But some of the content in the Parabellum update constituted a step towards it, a step in the wrong direction. And I want to talk about it. Now yes, I agree, there are things beyond player agency that make games, including SCP-SL, fun and engaging. Goofing off with your friends in Peanuts Room, role-playing, different characters, etc., etc. But for the purposes of my following arguments, all we need to agree upon is that the impact you have on a round comprises an important part of that fun and engagement, at least some of the time. To begin, we must properly define player agency. It is a term I have borrowed from story-focused game design that, in its original context, pertained to the extent of an individual player's ability to alter the course of the story through their chosen actions within the game. When translated to our context, player agency is defined as the extent of an individual player's ability to impact the outcome or course of a given in-game situation, whether that be an enemy engagement, item hunt, round outcome, so on, through their chosen actions within the game. Simply put, how much can your actions influence a win? For example, say you are playing as a facility guard, and decide, upon seeing the Blighter enter entrance zone, to attack SCP-939 instead of fleeing from him. Admirable. You hope that by doing this you can damage the dog, making him easier for MTF to kill later. In this way, your decision makes a positive impact for your team. Prior to Parabellum, this decision would indeed have made that positive impact, as you would have diminished SCP-939's health pool, by an amount, crucially, proportional to your skills at dodging, aiming, and luring him on. Since the Parabellum update, however, choosing to engage the dog as a lone facility guard can yield exactly 0 benefits to your team, as the SCP has been given recharging Hume shields, the bane of my existence. 500 hit points of regainable health stand between you and any impact you may have on the game in this scenario, a number of hit points greater, typically, than the damage you can deal in one clip. Since Parabellum, you now have no meaningful choice. Since you can't deal damage to the dog if you engage him, your only reasonable option is to run. This situation now repeats itself across most SCP encounters when you're playing as an MTF guard or scientist. As long as you are alone and without the micro-HID, the only SCP even worth attacking is the Doctor, and perhaps Larry. All the other SCPs will either be able to kill you or escape before you can penetrate their rechargeable shields. But wait, I hear you calling. This is intentional. It is meant to encourage teamwork, silly. You're meant to get multiple MTFs together to break through the shields and deal the damage. Sure, I can acquiesce that Hume shields do indeed encourage teamwork. In fact, they necessitate it. And therein lies the problem. Prior to Parabellum, teamwork was heavily encouraged anyway, regardless of shields. The massive health of any SCP essentially dictated that no lone MTF could hope to finish one off completely with only his own rifle, and so was left wanting his team. He could, however, crucially, given he didn't have his team there, still make a genuine impact regardless of the fact. And the level of impact he could make was, largely, determined by his skill at attacking, pit against the SCP's skill at evading. Eliminating the lone NTF's ability to do anything significant only serves to reduce player agency when players are alone, and remove any stakes and payoff, competition, between that player and any SCP. Besides the impact on MTF gameplay, SCP gameplay has also become more stale. Since Dog and Peanut now have their own Hume shields, they can operate independently from other SCPs without any real risk of being eliminated, essentially just becoming budget bin Larrys. Sure, Peanut can't run into entrance at the moment of a spawn wave, and Dog too will get shredded if he rushes into a room full of MTF, but on the whole, the shields introduced in Parabellum make Dog and Peanut's reliance on other SCPs far lower. This discourages teamwork amongst the SCP team, which, I would argue, is the most interesting aspect of playing as an SCP. The other issue with Dog and Peanut's Hume shields is that their playstyles, as mentioned prior, have begun to converge with Larry's. While neither is quite as tanky when facing a large group, their best strategy for engaging a single target is now roughly identical. Just follow him. A lone NTF can't do much beyond the shields, so the Dog or Peanut has little incentive to get creative. This role convergence makes each SCP, including Larry, feel less unique to play, and to play against. As you can see then, the introduction of Hume shields to two originally soft SCPs has had a disproportionately negative impact on the game. Any solo encounter with these SCPs since the change now offers distinctly less variety, intrigue, and ability for the MTF player to make any difference to the outcome of the game. This, from my experience, leaves the MTF player feeling, essentially, as though he might as well have not been there. To explain my next related point, I'd like to propose a way of thinking about asymmetric games such as SCP-SL that helps show a growing problem. Essentially, imagine an encounter between, say, Shy Guy and an MTF. If we frame the encounter as a competition between the Shy Guy and MTF players' respective skill levels, then we can see that, of course, the more skilled player will win. However, there are more factors to consider beyond each player's raw skill, and these factors added together are what we can call the comparative advantage, affecting the competition. Simply, the comparative advantage represents any innate or inherent advantage that Shy Guy or the MTF has in the situation. For example, if the MTF has a micro-HID, then he has a significant comparative advantage compared to the Shy Guy. Whereas if the Shy Guy is enraged and was looked at by the MTF, who doesn't have a micro-HID in this case, the Shy Guy has a significant comparative advantage over the MTF. Bringing comparative advantage and skill level together, the skill level of the player that holds the comparative advantage will have more influence, proportional to the size of that comparative advantage, than the skill level of the player at the equivalent comparative disadvantage. In the situation where the MTF player has a micro-HID, his skill with the micro is going to have considerably more impact on the outcome of the fight than the Shy Guy player's skill at evading the micro. No matter how competent the Shy Guy is at evading it, there is no way he can hope to best an NTF player who is even mediocre at aiming it. Hence the comparative advantage. If it helps, imagine the competition as a series of percentages. In a competition with no comparative advantage to either side, what we might call a fair fight, each player's skill has the same level of impact on the outcome. If player 1 is arbitrary skill level 50 out of 100, actual number doesn't matter, it's a representation, and player 2 is skill level 60 out of 100, and comparative advantage sits at 50%, i.e. none, player 2 will of course win. However, in a competition where comparative advantage sits at 65%, the adjusted scores read as such. Even though player 1's skill is lower, his comparative advantage has allowed that skill to be put to better use than player 2's higher raw skill, and so in this instance, player 1 comes out on top. Generally, from what I can tell, it is preferable for situations to contain less rather than more comparative advantage. Otherwise, players can become jaded at unfair fights, and rightly feel as though they are losing to far less skillful players only because of the situation. In terms of SCPs versus humans, this gets really interesting, as the entire premise of the SCP is as a power class, a class that has inherent comparative advantage over its lessers, and this is what creates the unique challenge and thrill of successfully escaping an SCP. If you have managed that, then you have not only proven that you are a more skillful player than the SCP player, but that you are a significantly more skillful player than them, as you have not only overcome their skill, but also their comparative advantage. I think this is great, and it's an integral part of what makes SCP-SL so compelling. However, comparative advantage to SCPs, or other classes, can be taken too far. When an SCP's comparative advantage is so great that it becomes near impossible for a human player to escape regardless of their skill level, issues begin to emerge. Take, for analogy, chess. If your skill at chess is, well, your skill, and Comparative Advantage is which pieces each player begins with. When your opponent begins with 3 queens and you adjust your king, no level of skill on your part is going to save you, and you're going to feel cheated and jaded when you inevitably lose. Indeed, the only game really being played, given your skill level is out of the question, is how quickly your opponent can dispatch you. Your only hope is if they make a series of preposterous mistakes, and if they do, and you do succeed, it feels equally hollow, as you know that it wasn't your input that won you the game, but their ridiculous failures. This extreme dynamic exists throughout SCPSL in numerous different circumstances, most of them involving PC, but as a Parabellum, it's unfortunately best exemplified by SCP-173. Peanut's comparative advantage over a human player is so high that many human players have little to no input at all. This leads only to frustration on the part of the human player, and potentially apathy for the Peanut player. According to some data I collected from some generous SCPSL players, only 25% of those players gave themselves a 75% chance or higher of escaping Peanut given they encountered him alone, and 50% gave themselves a 25% or lower chance of the same. The remainder gave themselves a 50-50 chance. It should be mentioned that, given the relatively low, 28 number of respondents to the survey, the data should be taken with a grain of salt. Case in point, this dude who claims to be able to escape an enraged shy guy that he triggered alone 100% of the time. It might also be prudent to assume that typically more experienced players will have taken the survey, as they will have been more likely to be active in the Discord servers it was published in, and thus the numbers might skew somewhat towards successful escapes than the average SCPSL player. Nevertheless, when we compare the numbers for Peanut to respondents' assessments of their ability to evade Shy Guy once they enraged him, 75% gave themselves a 25% or lower chance, we see that, for some players, skill can save them from SCP-173. The similarities, as to be expected, continue as we look at those respondents who gave themselves a very low chance of escaping. 25% of respondents gave themselves a 10% or lower chance of escaping SCP-173, given they encountered him alone. This is only 14% less than the 39% of respondents who gave themselves the same 10% chance of escaping an enraged Shy Guy that they had looked at while alone. If you have an SCP that many players find comparably difficult to escape from to a triggered Shy Guy, then you have a problem. In Shy Guy's case, the low chance of escape is generally reasonable, as you, as a human player, have already made a mistake by looking at him. With Peanut, however, it's hard to see how, simply by encountering him, you've made any mistake at all. You just got unlucky.
Oh, I guess I'll die.
For many players, then, the Peanut is a deterministic death sentence. They're not even remotely capable of escaping his grasp. Allow me to reiterate that these players have not made any real mistake by encountering Peanut, just got unlucky enough to find him, and so their deaths to him will feel them leaving disheartened, as they couldn't have done anything about it. None of the other SCPs, beyond an enraged Shy Guy, which is less important for reasons explained, suffer from nearly the same level of overpower. Again, compared to the 50% of respondents that gave themselves a 25% or lower chance of escaping Peanut, none rated their chances 25% or lower for an encounter with Doctor, or an unenraged Shy Guy. 29% gave themselves the same low chance to escape Larry, and 25% were equally pessimistic about their chances to escape the dog. As can be seen, Peanut's difficulty level is near double that of all other SCPs. Now, the one glaring limitation of my survey is that I asked people to imagine themselves encountering these SCPs alone, and Peanut is famously bad at dealing with groups. So, yeah, I admit that my data doesn't fully reflect Peanut's capabilities in all situations. However, consider that Peanut also excels when paired with either PC or Shy Guy, whereas other SCPs gain arguably less benefit from teamwork. And since this wasn't a part of the survey, players weren't accounting for that either. Regardless, from a human player's perspective, they are far less likely to be killed by Peanut if they have 3 other human players with them, because the Peanut has to choose which one to target. From the Peanut's perspective, however, his chances of killing are relatively similar, and so it comes yet again down to the luck, as the human player, of not being selected as the target. Hume shields on Dog and Peanut, then, and the large comparative advantage of Peanut when matched against a human class, are the main 2 issues I take with the Parabellum update, because they both lead to significantly reduced player agency, and therefore enjoyment. There are other issues with the game along the same lines, of course, but I don't find them as severe. Shy Guy, for instance, resembles to the individual player an undamageable SCP, akin to the post-Parabellum Peanut or Dog. But at least Shy Guy can't kill you while he remains untouchable. And I reckon having a single SCP with numerous drawbacks that does, for the most part, require MTF cooperation is generally a good thing. Or at least not as disastrous as having 2 without any real weaknesses. And similarly to Peanut's immense comparative advantage over lone human players, PC can exert it over groups. However, at least PC requires the cooperation of his teammates in order to do it. In chess terms, the PC situation more resembles a board where you, as with Peanut, have no pieces besides your king, but the PC, instead of having queens like Peanut, has only pawns. He'll get you eventually, but it'll take a while at least. Additionally, I find some of the smaller changes, such as the ability to reload upon spawning to chamber one extra round, mildly frustrating. I mean, why doesn't the gun start fully loaded? It's just annoying to have to do this when I spawn. But these issues are frankly water under the bridge, compared to the larger ones pertaining to player agency. Though I am distinctly not a game designer, I also reckon that if I'm going to spend a moment of everyone's time pointing out the flaws in something, I might as well try to come up with some solutions. In terms of SCP-939, 173, and the individual player's inability to damage them, I reckon the solution is reasonably intuitive. For Dog, just return to a pre-Parabellum state of no Hume shields. This will incentivize more creative play and teamwork on the dog's part. Maybe the dog can make use of its silent walk and voice chat features, and ensure that lone human players can still feel as though they've made a difference if they shoot at it. It returns the dog-human matchup to one where both parties have something to lose, thereby raising the stakes, tension, and payoff. For Peanut's part, the story is a little more complicated. Though I do consider pre-Parabellum Peanut's mechanics, this is besides his visual update, to be superior to those post-Parabellum, I nonetheless recognize that his pre-Parabellum mechanics were not that great overall. I imagine the challenge of creating a fun and fair SCP that can literally teleport somewhat haunts Northwood Studios. Funnily enough, it now haunts me too. And I don't, frankly, have a full potential solution. What I can offer is the notion that the Peanut player's ability to see exactly where he is going to emerge from his blink, and his ability to, by and large, time it himself, contributes most heavily to the problem the SCP faces. See, when Peanut's player has perfect information, and all the choice on when to execute, the only constraint remaining is his ability to aim. This leaves the human player with no real opportunity for counterplay, as no matter how well he dodges, SCP-173's player only needs to be decent enough at aiming. There is our comparative advantage. Stripping the class of its teleport location indicator and tying his teleport to a timer instead of a manual choice would undoubtedly assist in this. However, it could lead the class to being too janky, or pose optics problems for Northwood in the form of people accusing them of simply reverting to old Peanut's mechanics. Look, I'm not sure if there's a perfect Peanut out there, or if the contradiction between fair play and teleportation is just too severe, but that doesn't have to stop us from trying to make it better. Cheers! However, consider that Peanut also excels when paired with a Peanut. Does it?